Hi, my name is Talon Miller. This is my video for the second pop media class with Don Entree, Journal 12, on the X-Files. Um, in this video, we are going to be going over um, the episode that I watched was Quagmire from Season 3, and we're analyzing some cognitive capabilities of the two main characters. Um, so, we're going to be analyzing their problem-solving strategies, cognitive obstacles they might face, their insight and creativity, and the effectiveness of their approaches. So, what I'm going to talk about first is the type of intelligence that they tend to lean to. There's analytical intelligence, which is like academic problem solving and computation, practical intelligence, which is like street smarts and common sense, and creative intelligence, which is imaginative and innovative problem solving. So, just within the episode I watched, I think that Scully tends towards analytical intelligence, and Mulder tends towards creative intelligence. Um, there's a lot of examples of Scully kind of you they find this scale in the beginning of the episode, and she compares it to a bug carapace, and so she's kind of using her academic knowledge of like the materials of these animals to make a comparison. Um, she's inherently more skeptical about the paranormal stuff going on in the show, and she kind of doesn't believe it until there's like really hard proof of things. Um, she also doesn't really see a point in like finding the monster. You know, she kind of gets depressed in this episode after her dog dies, which is uh, just a detail of why her mood is kind of like this. But they have this conversation where she is not really into like finding the monster as much as Mulder is, and it shows that she's a lot not really have like that drive to like use creative imagination to find this thing. Mulder, um, he's kind of always looking out for paranormal things, and he's using creative solutions to find it. He uses the sonar. This is also kind of getting into their problem-solving strategies. Um, Mulder uses sonar to find the monster, which is kind of a normally those things are only for fish, but they realize they can use it for the river monster. Um, Whenever they get into the emergency on the boat, that's also an example of them using schemas. Like they use schemas of like what to do in an emergency when their boat crashes. That's an example of like them doing problem solving. Um, in terms of actual problem solving strategies, there's trial and error, algorithm, and heuristic. Trial and error is like trying solutions until a problem is solved. Algorithm is step by step formula, and heuristic uses an existing framework. I think they actually both kind of tend towards heuristic because they do a lot of like applying their prior knowledge to new situations. Um, Especially Mulder uses more like outside of the box kind of creative thinking. Um, but he does have, in this episode, I only found one real example of a um, cognitive obstacle, which for a brief point they were analyzing like tracks of the animal, and he was really fixated that this was like a good piece of proof, and the tracks really were not proof. It was like we see that it was just a guy kind of drumming up publicity about the monster, but he didn't realize that the tracks were obviously too shallow to really be a creature, and Scully had to point that out for him, and that kind of shows how she is more realistic and like maybe academic intelligence than him. He's kind of really excited and wants to find, a paranormal monster. Um, that was the main cognitive obstacle I found. Um, we also see an example of Scully's kind of algorithmic more thinking, as well as it's also kind of heuristic. They're talking about a lot of these victims are kind of died in the lake, so she uses her information of drowning victims when like analyzing a body to kind of try and determine what might have happened to him. and so that kind of shows a problem-solving strategy she employs. Um, and that's really like I think that's one of the most defining things about their relationship is that she's kind of grounded, and Mulder is really trying to like stretch concepts to fit his narrative, which that, by the way, is an example of him being kind of heuristic, but also his creative thinking aspect. Um, Mulder has a lot of the most creative thinking aspects in the show. There's a lot. There's a scene where they're talking to the frog guy. In this episode, there's a researcher who does frogs, and he's telling him about how he's introducing new frogs because the frogs in the river are dying, and he brings this into like a theory about how um, the that must mean that's why the monster is killing people because it used to feed on the frogs. There's no frogs anymore, so it's feeding on people, right? So that's kind of a creative way to think about a problem. He's really like extrapolating a theory off of very limited information. Um, so that shows that creative aspect of him. Um, they both have a lot of good like insight. They kind of that's just like it's kind of definitive of their dynamic. Like Scully sort of uh, finds information and Mulder takes it somewhere, right? And so I would say probably Scully has the most insight out of them. She has insight into like uh, she has more like examples of using complex prior knowledge in these examples. I think that the way they think and the way they solve these mysteries are very effective for them. In this particular episode, they didn't find the monster. They eventually uh, found an alligator that was going after Mulder, and then they kind of assumed that that was the monster all along. But we see at the very end that there was really like a Loch Ness style monster in the river. So, in a way, it's effective because they're like good detectives, but because of the paranormal quality and like the skepticalness, they kind of once they find a reasonable solution, they don't really keep going. So that's kind of how I feel about that. Um, they both do a lot of interviewing of people to find information, and in a way, that's sort of an algorithmic way to solve problems because that's sort of like a more like defined sort of step by step process to take. Um, and a lot of times I remember feeling like Scully was more involved in the interviews in this episode, so that kind of shows more how she's like an algorithmic thinker, and maybe Mulder is a heuristic thinker. Um, but anyway, that is pretty much a lot of what I got from the episode that I watched on this. I thought this was a very fun assignment. I've never really watched the X Files, even though I've heard a lot about it. But this episode was a good introduction for me. I was sad about the dog dying in this episode, but yeah, I thought, and this was a good way to think about problem solving strategies because they're really doing a lot of investigative stuff. But that's gonna be it. Thank you.